When fourth-generation farmer Jackson Hayes rigged UV powder trackers to his stolen heirloom tomatoes, he never expected to expose a massive food fraud conspiracy orchestrated by the nation's largest organic distributor, a discovery that would spark millions of views online, trigger federal investigations, and revolutionize how America protects its small farmers from corporate exploitation. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary story, tell us where you're watching from. And if this journey intrigues you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something truly remarkable for you. The summer sun had barely cleared the horizon when Jackson Hayes discovered yet another section of his heirloom tomato crop had been systematically harvested overnight. At 58, the weathered farmer stood motionless between the ravaged rows, his calloused hands clenched in frustration. The careful precision of the theft was unmistakable. Only his prize Purple Cherokee tomatoes had been taken, with nearby varieties left completely untouched. "Fourth time this month," Jackson muttered, kneeling to examine the clean cuts on the remaining stems. This wasn't random vandalism or desperate people stealing food. These thieves knew exactly what they were targeting: an heirloom variety that commanded premium prices at farmers' markets and high-end restaurants throughout the region. For 4 generations, the Hayes family had worked these 75 acres nestled in the fertile valley of Riverdale County. Jackson's great-grandfather had purchased the land in 1907, passing down not just property, but a philosophy of sustainable farming that had become increasingly rare in modern agriculture. Jackson had transformed the traditional family farm into a certified organic operation 15 years earlier, a decision that had saved them when commodity crop prices collapsed, but now made them a target for this new, mysterious threat. "Dad?" called a voice from down the row. Olivia Hayes, Jackson's 32-year-old daughter, approached with a clipboard and a concerned expression. 6 months earlier, she had put her promising career at an environmental non-profit on hold when the family farm's financial situation became critical. Her degree in agricultural business and marketing experience had already helped modernize their operation, but even her expertise couldn't overcome the combined challenges of 3 consecutive drought years, mounting equipment debt, and now these escalating thefts. "They hit us again," Jackson replied unnecessarily as she surveyed the damage. Olivia crouched beside her father, examining the precision of the cuts. "This is different from the other thefts," she observed. "Look at how methodical they were. They even avoided the plants that weren't at peak ripeness. Whoever did this knows tomatoes better than most farmers." Jackson nodded grimly. "These aren't teenagers or random vandals. These are professionals." At current market prices, last night's theft represented nearly $2,000 in lost revenue, money the Hayes farm desperately needed to make their next equipment loan payment. The banking officer had been clear during their last meeting: miss another payment and they would begin foreclosure proceedings despite the family's long history with the bank. "Let me guess, Sheriff Davidson gave you the same speech about filing reports and documentation for insurance?" Olivia asked, as they walked back toward the farmhouse, the morning sun now illuminating the full extent of their violated fields. "Said, his department doesn't have the manpower for nightly patrols," Jackson confirmed. "Mentioned setting up game cameras again, as if we hadn't tried that already. The insurance adjuster called too. They're claiming these thefts fall under our crop loss deductible, which means we'll get pennies on the dollar if anything." Olivia's expression hardened as she pulled up their financial projections on her tablet. "We can't keep absorbing these losses, Dad. Between the theft and the drought impact, we're looking at a $30,000 shortfall by harvest end. The bank won't extend our operating loan again." They reached the crest of the hill that offered a view of the entire Hayes property, and beyond it, the vast, uniform fields of evergreen agricultural enterprises. The corporate farming operation had gradually purchased every adjacent family farm over the past decade, creating a sea of conventional, high-yield agriculture surrounding the Hayes Organic Island. "Martin came by yesterday," Jackson said, referring to Evergreen's local operations manager. "Made another offer on our water rights. Said they'd be willing to lease back the land to us if we're emotionally attached to farming it." Olivia's face flushed with anger. How generous of them. They undercut our prices at every market, lobby against organic certification standards, and now they want our water. Did he mention the offer decreases every time they make it? Jackson removed his worn cap and wiped his brow, gazing across fields that had sustained 4 generations of his family. "We're running out of options, Liv. These thefts are targeted and professional. Someone knows exactly what we're growing, when it's ready, and how to harvest it properly. And the sheriff won't help," Olivia added, "because technically it's just agricultural loss in their eyes, not a priority crime. Meanwhile, we've got 3 restaurant contracts we might not be able to fulfill." That evening, as sunset painted the farmhouse in golden hues, Jackson sat at his workshop bench, surrounded by an odd collection of materials: motion-activated trail cameras, wireless transmitters, UV reactive powder, and a set of small 3D printed containers his neighbor's tech-savvy son had helped him design. "You're really going through with this?" Olivia asked, bringing him a cup of coffee as she examined his improvised security system with a mixture of doubt and admiration. "Got no choice." "Left," Jackson replied, carefully filling the containers with the harmless but stubbornly persistent UV powder. "If law enforcement can't catch them, maybe we can at least track where our produce ends up." The plan had come to him after a sleepless night researching agricultural theft prevention. His solution was both simple and desperate: a last-ditch effort to gather evidence about who was stealing their premium organic crops and why. The small trackers would be carefully attached to selected tomatoes throughout the field, designed to be invisible to casual inspection, but capable of transmitting location data through a specialized app on his phone. The UV powder, completely food-safe but visible under blacklight for up to 2 weeks after contact, would mark both the thieves and any containers used to transport the stolen produce. "I talked to Miguel at the farmer's market yesterday," Jackson continued, referring to another organic farmer from the next county. "He's had similar thefts, specifically his heritage peppers and specialty eggplants. Nothing else touched. Same. Precision harvesting. You think this is organized?" Olivia asked, the implications dawning on her. "No one steals this systematically without a distribution network," Jackson confirmed. "It's not about catching them in the act anymore. It's about following the supply chain, finding out where these premium organic crops are ending up." Olivia picked up one of the tiny trackers, examining the craftsmanship. "These are pretty sophisticated for homemade devices. How much did this setup cost us?" "Less than what we lost in the last theft," Jackson replied, not meeting her eyes. They both knew he'd used money set aside for the irrigation repair, a gamble they couldn't afford to lose. As midnight approached, Jackson and Olivia worked methodically through their remaining tomato plants, installing the tracking devices on the ripest specimens most likely to be targeted. Each tracker was carefully concealed within the stem end of the tomato, invisible unless specifically examined. The UV powder containers were strategically placed to rupture if the tomatoes were handled roughly or placed in collection bins. "Now, we wait," Jackson said as they finished, scanning the moonlit fields one last time before heading back to the farmhouse. What Jackson couldn't know as he deployed his homemade tracking system was that his simple defensive measure would uncover something far beyond local theft. The data from his trackers would expose a sophisticated nationwide food fraud operation that had been manipulating markets, deceiving consumers, and threatening the livelihoods of organic farmers across the country. As he carefully concealed the last tracker in a particularly perfect specimen of Purple Cherokee, the exhausted farmer was simply hoping to gather enough evidence for the sheriff to take action. He had no way of knowing that within 3 weeks, His improvised security system would trigger viral videos, multiple federal investigations, and eventually lead to congressional hearings on agricultural fraud that would transform how America protected its food supply and the farmers who produced it. What began as one farmer's desperate attempt to protect his crops would ultimately expose how a multi-billion-dollar corporation had been systematically stealing premium organic produce, repackaging it under their own labels, and selling counterfeit organic products to unsuspecting consumers nationwide. A revelation that would not only save Hayes family farms, but fundamentally change the relationship between small-scale producers and massive distribution networks throughout the agricultural industry. 3 nights passed with no activity in the Hayes family's tomato fields. Jackson checked his tracking app obsessively, the tension building with each quiet evening. By the 4th morning, dark circles had formed under his eyes from lack of sleep, his worry deepening that the thieves had somehow detected his trap, or worse, moved on to another vulnerable farm. "You need to rest, Dad," Olivia insisted, taking over the morning irrigation check. "The app will alert you if anything moves. You can't keep this up." Jackson reluctantly agreed, retreating to the farmhouse for a few hours of fitful sleep. It was just past noon when the distinctive alert tone from his phone jolted him awake. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the tracking application to find multiple signals suddenly active. The trackers were on the move. "Olivia," he called, rushing onto the porch where his daughter was updating their online marketplace listings. "They hit us again, broad daylight this time." Together they stared at the screen, watching in real time as over a dozen trackers moved rapidly away from their property. Unlike the previous nighttime thefts, this brazen daylight operation suggested the thieves had grown confident in their impunity. "They're heading east on County Road 218, Olivia observed, already grabbing the truck keys. "We need to follow them." "What about the sheriff?" Jackson asked, though he was already pulling on his boots. "We'll call once we have something concrete," Olivia replied. "Davidson made it clear he needs evidence, not theories." Within minutes, they were in Jackson's weathered pickup truck, following the digital breadcrumbs leading away from their farm. The tracking app showed the stolen tomatoes moving at approximately 45 miles per hour, clearly in a vehicle, not simply carried by individuals on foot. "They're turning onto the interstate," Jackson noted as they approached the highway entrance. The signals were now moving rapidly northbound toward the state capital. "Who steals tomatoes with a getaway vehicle?" "Professional distributors," Olivia theorized, her marketing background piecing together the puzzle. "High-end organic produce can command 3 times the price of conventional. If someone's reselling our certified organic tomatoes without paying for them..." They followed the interstate for nearly an hour, maintaining a safe distance while watching the tracker signals on Olivia's tablet. The digital markers eventually exited the highway and proceeded through a series of increasingly industrial areas before stopping completely at what appeared to be a large warehouse complex. "Consolidated Foods Distribution Center," Olivia read from the sprawling sign that dominated the facility entrance. "I know them. They're one of the largest regional organic produce distributors. They supply most of the high-end grocery chains and farm-to-table restaurants in 3 states. Jackson frowned, processing this information. Why would a legitimate distributor need to steal produce? They could just buy it directly. "Unless they're not paying organic prices," Olivia suggested, a disturbing theory forming. "Or worse, they're selling conventional produce as organic and boosting their margins by mixing in actual organic items." They parked across the street from the facility, watching as trucks moved in and out of the loading docks. The tracking app confirmed their stolen tomatoes remained inside the warehouse, stationary for now. "We need to get closer," Jackson decided, "see if we can spot any of our produce." Security at the facility was minimal. focused primarily on the main entrance, while the vast shipping area operated with typical industrial efficiency. Jackson and Olivia circled around to a service entrance where workers on break provided enough activity to make their presence less conspicuous. "Look," Olivia whispered, pointing toward a loading dock where workers were transferring crates from a small, unmarked truck to the warehouse. "That's Miguel's turquoise harvest bins, the ones he reported stolen last month." Jackson nodded grimly, raising his phone to capture video evidence. As they watched, workers unloaded multiple containers of various premium produce: heirloom, tomatoes, specialty peppers, and organic herbs, all items reported stolen from small farms throughout the region. "We need to see where they go next," Jackson muttered. "The trackers show they're being moved deeper into the facility." An opportunity presented itself when a warehouse worker propped open a side door to smoke a cigarette. After the employee returned inside, Olivia approached confidently, as if she belonged there, motioning for her father to follow. Years of delivering their own produce to distribution centers had taught them both how these operations functioned and how to blend in amid the controlled chaos. Inside, they followed signs toward the specialty produce processing area, using the tracking app to navigate toward their stolen goods. Through a large observation window, they witnessed something that stopped them in their tracks. Workers were systematically removing produce from various containers, including the distinctive crates from small organic farms, and consolidating everything into uniform Consolidated Foods packaging stamped with certified organic labels. "They're washing everything together," Jackson whispered, recognizing the industrial produce cleaning system. Conventional and organic mixed in the same processing line. Olivia's eyes widened. "That's a direct violation of organic certification requirements. There are strict separation protocols for processing." Moving closer, they found an inconspicuous vantage point to document the operation. Jackson activated his phone's camera while Olivia retrieved a small UV flashlight from her pocket, a crucial component of their tracking system. "Let's see if we can confirm it's our produce," she whispered, waiting for a moment when no workers were looking in their direction. When she briefly illuminated the processing area with the UV light, the results were unmistakable. The specialized powder they had applied to their tomatoes glowed brightly, not just on the produce itself, but on the handling equipment, the workers' gloves, and the organic certified packaging being prepared for distribution. "Got it," Jackson breathed, capturing everything on video. "They're taking stolen organic produce, mixing it with conventional, and selling it all as premium organic." "This is massive fraud," Olivia added, her voice tight with anger. "They're not just stealing from farmers, they're deceiving consumers and undermining the entire organic certification system." Their documentation complete, they carefully retreated toward the exit, only to round a corner and come face to face with Martin Davis, Evergreen Agricultural's local operations manager, the same man who had repeatedly tried to purchase their water rights. "Hayes!" Martin's surprise quickly transformed into suspicion. "What are you doing here? This is a restricted area." Before Jackson could formulate a response, a security alarm began blaring throughout the facility. "Security breach in Sector 5, announced an overhead speaker. "All unauthorized personnel must be detained. You need to leave." "Now!" Martin hissed, unexpectedly shoving them toward a nearby emergency exit. "I was never here. You were never here. Understand?" And confused by this apparent assistance from a man they'd considered an adversary, Jackson and Olivia pushed through the emergency door and sprinted toward their truck, the facility's security personnel now visible in pursuit. "Why did he help us?" Olivia gasped as they pulled away from the curb, security guards emerging from the facility, too late to stop them. "I don't know," Jackson admitted, his mind racing to process what they'd witnessed and what it might mean. "But he clearly knows. Something about what's happening in there. As they sped back toward their farm, the full implications of their discovery began to sink in. This wasn't simply a case of local theft. They had stumbled upon a sophisticated fraud operation, potentially worth millions of dollars, involving one of the region's largest food distributors and possibly connected to the corporate agricultural interests that had been pressuring small organic farmers for years. "We need to take this to the authorities," Olivia insisted, reviewing the video evidence they'd captured. "This goes way beyond the sheriff's department. This is FDA territory, federal. Organic certification fraud." Jackson nodded grimly. "We'll need more than just video. We need to prove the connection between the thefts and the distribution center, show the whole supply chain." They spent the evening meticulously documenting everything: the tracking data, time-stamped video evidence, UV confirmation of their stolen produce, and a detailed timeline of the thefts reported throughout the region. By midnight, they had compiled a comprehensive case file that connected the systematic theft of premium organic produce to its fraudulent distribution. "First thing tomorrow, we contact the State Agricultural Department and the FDA," Jackson decided. "This isn't just about getting our tomatoes back anymore." What the exhausted farmer couldn't know, as he finally allowed himself a few hours of sleep, was that their evidence was about to spark something far more powerful than a simple regulatory investigation. The digital trail they had created was about to intersect with social media in a way that would amplify their discovery beyond anything they could have imagined. While Jackson and Olivia had been documenting the fraud at Consolidated Foods, the location data from their tracking system had been automatically uploading to cloud storage, a security feature implemented by their tech-savvy neighbor who had helped design the system. When that neighbor, 23-year-old, social media content creator Tyler Rodriguez, received notification of the unusual activity, he immediately recognized its viral potential. "Farmer uses genius UV tracker to catch professional crop thieves," read the title of the video Tyler uploaded at 1:37 a.m. Using the tracking data and a creative animation that showed how the tomatoes moved from Hayes family farms to the distribution center. The video provided a compelling visual narrative that required no specialized knowledge to understand. By the time Jackson awoke the following morning, the video had already accumulated 700,000 views and was being shared by environmental activists, food safety advocates, and organic farming communities across multiple platforms. What had begun as one farmer's desperate attempt to catch local thieves was rapidly transforming into a national conversation about food authenticity, corporate accountability, and the challenges facing small-scale organic producers. As Jackson reached for his phone to call the agricultural department, he was startled to find it overflowing with notifications, messages, and voicemails from journalists, advocacy organizations, and other farmers reporting similar thefts. Among them was a message from a federal investigator with the FDA's Food Fraud Division, requesting an urgent meeting regarding evidence of potentially widespread organic certification violations. The simple trap that Jackson Hayes had set to protect his tomatoes had caught something far bigger than thieves. It had exposed a system of fraud that extended throughout the food supply chain, and the evidence was now spreading across the internet at a pace no corporate damage control team could possibly contain. Jackson Hayes stared at his phone in disbelief as the notification count continued to climb past any number he'd ever seen on his device. The kitchen table of the farmhouse that had witnessed 4 generations of agricultural struggles was now command central for something that felt entirely outside his experience, a viral social media phenomenon with him at its center. "Dad, we're at 2.3 million views," Olivia announced. Her laptop opened to Tyler Rodriguez's video, titled "Farmer's Genius UV Trap Catches Massive Organic Food Fraud Ring." The young neighbor's skillful editing had transformed their evidence into a compelling 7-minute narrative that perfectly captured the David versus Goliath story of a small farmer outsmarting corporate thieves. CBS Morning News just called, she continued, scanning through messages. So did 3 major newspapers and a documentary producer. The FDA investigator is on her way here now, and the State Agricultural Commissioner's office wants all our documentation. Jackson rubbed his weathered face, struggling to process how quickly events were unfolding. Just yesterday, he had been a desperate farmer trying to catch common thieves. Now terms like whistleblower, food fraud investigation, and consumer protection, hero, were being attached to his name across media platforms. "What about the sheriff's department?" he asked, clinging to the familiar local authority that had initially dismissed his concerns. Olivia's expression hardened. "Sheriff Davidson called. Suddenly he's very interested in our case. Says he's launching a comprehensive investigation into agricultural theft in the county." Her air quotes made her skepticism clear. Amazing how 2 million views changes law enforcement priorities. A notification on Olivia's laptop interrupted their conversation. A breaking news alert from the Regional Business Journal. Consolidated Foods stock plummets 28% amid organic fraud allegations. Trading temporarily halted. "This is moving too fast," Jackson muttered, a lifetime of cautious farming making him wary of the rapidly escalating situation. "We need to be certain of our facts before people's livelihoods are affected." "The evidence is solid, Mr. Hayes," came a new voice from the doorway where Miguel Sanchez, their fellow organic farmer, stood with 3 others, all victims of similar thefts. "And you're not alone anymore." Miguel entered, followed by Sarah Chen from Wildflower Acres, Dean Washington from Heritage Harvests, and Layla Patel from Sunshine Organics, all small-scale certified organic farmers who had experienced precisely targeted thefts of their premium crops over the past season. "Tyler showed us your video this morning," Miguel explained. "We all recognized the pattern immediately. Same precision harvesting, same crops targeted, only the highest value organic varieties." Sarah Chen nodded emphatically. "They took my rare Japanese eggplant varieties 2 weeks ago, over $3,000 worth in a single night. Sheriff told me it was probably hungry deer, despite the clean cuts and selective harvesting. We've all been struggling to fulfill our contracts because of these thefts," Dean added. "Restaurants and specialty markets count on our products. When we can't deliver, we lose those relationships permanently." As the farmers compared experiences, a sleek government vehicle pulled into the Hayes farmyard. A professionally dressed woman in her 40s emerged, carrying a leather portfolio and a demeanor of unmistakable authority. "Mr. Hayes? I'm Special Agent Diana Reynolds, FDA Office of Criminal Investigations, Foodborne Food Fraud Division." She introduced herself, presenting credentials. "I believe you have evidence of potential organic certification violations that fall under federal jurisdiction." Within an hour, the Hayes farmhouse kitchen had transformed into an impromptu incident command center. Agent Reynolds methodically interviewed each farmer, while her team, arriving in a separate vehicle, collected detailed statements and documented the evidence from the tracking system. "The video that's circulating contains enough probable cause for us to obtain warrants," Reynolds explained. "We're coordinating with the USDA's National Organic Program Enforcement Team to secure the Consolidated Foods facility within the hour." As government wheels began turning with surprising speed, Olivia monitored the expanding online reaction. Agricultural advocacy groups were rallying around the story. Consumer protection organizations had launched petitions demanding investigation of all Consolidated Foods organic certification claims. Food safety experts were appearing on news programs explaining the significance of the apparent fraud. "Your trap didn't just catch thieves, Mr. Hayes," Agent Reynolds noted. You've potentially exposed one of the largest organic fraud operations we've seen in a decade. By mid-afternoon, the national media had descended on Hayes family farms. News vans lined the country road leading to the property, reporters standing in front of Jackson's fields with the farmhouse as backdrop. The contrast between the humble fourth-generation farmer in his worn overalls and the sophisticated tracking technology he'd deployed created a narrative irresistible to media outlets. "Mr. Hayes, how did you come up with the tracking system?" called one reporter as Jackson reluctantly emerged to provide a brief statement at Agent Reynolds' suggestion. "Did you suspect Consolidated Foods was behind the thefts?" shouted another. "Are corporate farms trying to force out organic competitors?" asked a third. Jackson raised his hands, uncomfortable with the attention but determined to stay focused. On the core issue, this isn't about me or my farm. This is about integrity in our food system. Consumers pay premium prices for organic produce because they believe in those standards. Farmers invest years obtaining and maintaining organic certification because we believe in those practices. If companies are circumventing that system for profit, everyone loses, except the fraudsters. His straightforward eloquence, born of genuine conviction rather than media training, resonated powerfully across the live broadcasts. On social media, clips of the humble farmer speaking truth to power were being shared with hashtags like "No Farm Fraud" and "Jack's Organic Integrity," amplifying the story further. As evening approached, Agent Reynolds received a call that visibly energized her. After a brief but intense conversation, she addressed the assembled farmers. The FDA and USDA just executed warrants at Consolidated Foods' main distribution center and headquarters. Initial findings have already confirmed the presence of the UV markers from Hayes Farm, produced in their certified organic packaging lines. They've also discovered documentation suggesting this operation extends to at least 7 distribution centers across 3 states. A collective murmur passed through the group as they processed the scale of what had been uncovered. "There's more," Reynolds continued. "Financial records indicate Consolidated has a subsidiary that's been systematically purchasing conventional produce at standard prices, then relabeling it as organic for premium prices. The stolen organic items were being mixed in to ensure random testing would detect genuine organic markers." "How long has this been happening?" Layla Patel asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Preliminary evidence suggests at least 3 years, Reynolds replied grimly. "We're still assessing the full scope, but based on volume estimates, this could represent hundreds of millions in fraudulent sales." The implications stunned everyone into momentary silence. For 3 years, legitimate organic farmers had been competing against their own stolen produce, fighting an unwinnable battle against fraudulently labeled products that could be sold at lower prices because they'd been acquired through theft or conventional sourcing. As darkness fell, a new development added another layer to the unfolding story. Tyler Rodriguez burst into the farmhouse, his normally casual demeanor replaced with urgent excitement. "You need to see this," he announced, placing his laptop on the kitchen table. "People are checking their premium organic produce with blacklights. It's happening all over the country." The screen showed dozens of social media videos from consumers who, inspired by the original viral post, had purchased UV flashlights and were examining their store-bought organic produce. In video after video, consumers discovered the telltale glow of Hayes Farm's tracking powder on tomatoes, peppers, and other products labeled as certified organic under Consolidated's premium house brand, Earth's Harvest. The UV powder spread through their entire processing system, Olivia realized. It's on everything that went through those same packing lines. Unintentional, but incredibly effective evidence, Agent Reynolds noted, already forwarding the social media links to her investigation team. As the evening progressed, Jackson stepped Outside for a moment of quiet, amid the chaos his simple tracking system had unleashed. Under the same stars that had watched over Hayes' family farms for 4 generations, he contemplated how his desperate attempt to protect his livelihood had evolved into something with such far-reaching implications. His solitude was interrupted by an incoming call from an unlisted number. Hesitantly he answered. "Mr. Hayes, this is Congresswoman Eleanor Watkins, chair of the House Agricultural Oversight Committee. I've been watching what's unfolding with your situation, and I believe it points to systemic issues requiring legislative attention. Would you be willing to testify before our committee next week about your experience and the vulnerabilities in our organic certification enforcement?" Before Jackson could fully process this request, he noticed headlights approaching down the long driveway, the 5th news crew of the day arriving for the story that was now leading broadcasts nationwide. Behind them came more vehicles, other organic farmers from surrounding counties who had heard about the gathering at Hayes Farm and were arriving with their own theft reports and evidence. What Jackson Hayes couldn't possibly know as he stood watching this impromptu convoy was that his homemade tracking system had not merely exposed a single company's fraud.
Ik zei uit dat links hebben we ook veel verwerken voor een verschillende trend. Zo, als we doen. Film in artje even obier de ftamage riba de maat til fleur et
Nighttime thieves had spread through processing centers, distribution networks, and retail supply chains, making visible a problem that had long remained hidden from consumers and regulators alike. And as evidence continued mounting across social media and federal investigations, the ripple effects were about to reach the highest levels of agricultural policy, food safety regulation, and corporate accountability. The simple farmer who had been dismissed by local law enforcement just days earlier was now at the center of a perfect storm of consumer activism, regulatory scrutiny, and media attention, a position he had never sought but would soon use to advocate for the struggling organic farmers who had been victims of both theft and systematic fraud designed to undermine their very existence in the marketplace. Jackson Hayes had never owned a suit until 3 days ago. Now, dressed in a hastily purchased navy blue ensemble that Olivia had insisted was necessary for the occasion, the 4th-generation farmer sat in a wood-paneled waiting room outside the House Agricultural Oversight Committee chambers. Through the nearby window, he could see the Washington Monument standing tall against the morning sky, a surreal backdrop for a man who rarely traveled beyond his county's borders. 5 minutes, Mr. Hayes, announced a congressional aide, clipboard in hand. The committee is just finishing their preliminary statements. Jackson nodded, tugging uncomfortably at his tie. Beside him, Olivia reviewed their presentation materials one last time, having worked through the night to distill their evidence into the clear, concise format required for congressional testimony. "Remember, Dad, just tell the truth, exactly. As it happened, that's what they need to hear," she reassured him, sensing his tension. "Never thought catching tomato thieves would land me here," Jackson muttered, still processing the whirlwind events of the past 10 days. Those days had transformed everything. The viral video of his tracking system had now surpassed 47 million views across platforms. The FDA and USDA joint investigation had expanded to include Consolidated Foods distribution centers in 7 states. Major retailers had pulled the company's Earth's Harvest organic line from shelves pending verification of certification claims. Most significantly, over 200 organic farmers nationwide had come forward with reports of similar targeted thefts, suggesting a systematic operation far beyond anything initially imagined. "Mr. Hayes, they're ready for you now," the aide announced, holding open the heavy wooden door. Jackson took a deep breath and entered the hearing room, immediately confronted by the intimidating semicircular dais where committee members sat facing him. Behind them, a packed gallery of observers, media representatives, and industry stakeholders filled every available seat. Directly across from his witness table sat executives from Consolidated Foods, their expressions a mixture of concern and controlled hostility. The committee recognizes Mr. Jackson Hayes, owner-operator of Hayes Family Farms, announced Chairwoman Eleanor Watkins, a formidable legislator known for her advocacy on agricultural transparency issues. Mr. Hayes, you have 10 minutes for your opening statement before questions. As Jackson approached the microphone, he momentarily froze, the banks of cameras and unfamiliar formality nearly overwhelming his carefully prepared thoughts. Then from the back of the room, he spotted a group of familiar faces: Miguel, Sarah, Dean, and Layla, the fellow organic farmers who had joined his cause. Their presence centered him, reminding him why he was there. "I'm not accustomed to speaking in settings like this," he began, his authentic farmer's voice carrying surprising authority in the formal chamber. 10 days ago, I was just trying to stop thieves from taking my tomatoes. Today, I'm here because those tomatoes led us to something much bigger. A systematic fraud that's harming farmers, deceiving consumers, and undermining the integrity of our entire food certification system. Over the next 10 minutes, Jackson methodically detailed his experience: the precision thefts targeting only premium organic crops, the homemade tracking system born of desperation, and the shocking discovery at Consolidated Foods distribution center. He explained how their simple UV powder had revealed an elaborate fraud network designed to exploit the price differential between conventional and organic produce. "This isn't just about stolen tomatoes," he concluded. "It's about trust. Farmers trust that honest practices will be rewarded in the marketplace. Consumers trust that certifications mean something. When companies can systematically undermine that trust for profit, the entire system fails. And when that system fails, small farms like mine, farms that have fed communities for generations, cannot survive." As Jackson finished, the room remained silent for a moment before Chairwoman Watkins spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Your straightforward testimony is precisely why this committee requested your presence." She turned toward the Consolidated Foods representatives. "Perhaps Mr. Chambers would like to respond to these allegations." Richard Chambers, CEO of Consolidated Foods, leaned into his microphone with practiced corporate composure. "While we take these allegations seriously, we believe Mr. Hayes's evidence represents isolated incidents, possibly caused by rogue employees, not systematic corporate practice. Consolidated Foods has been a trusted name in distribution for over 30 years, and we—" "Excuse me, Mr. Chambers," interrupted Congresswoman Watkins, "but we have some additional evidence to present before your response continues." She nodded to a staff member who distributed folders to committee members. "The committee has received documentation from 7 former Consolidated Foods employees detailing what they describe as an explicit corporate strategy called organic blending, designed to maximize profits through the deliberate mixing of conventional or produce into organic streams." Murmurs spread through the gallery as Chambers consulted urgently with his legal team. Jackson exchanged glances with Olivia, realizing there were dimensions to this investigation extending far beyond their original discovery. Chairwoman Watkins continued, "Additionally, FDA investigators have provided preliminary findings indicating that approximately 68% of randomly tested organic products distributed by Consolidated contained pesticide residues consistent with conventional farming practices, an impossibility if proper organic handling protocols were being followed. For the next 3 hours, the hearing unfolded like a meticulously constructed case, with committee members from both parties united in their questioning of Consolidated's practices. Jackson watched in astonishment as his simple tracking system was repeatedly referenced as the catalyst that had finally exposed a fraud mechanism industry experts had suspected but never proven. During a brief recess, Agent Reynolds approached Jackson in the hallway outside the hearing room. "Your testimony was excellent, Mr. Hayes. Direct and credible, exactly what was needed." She hesitated before adding, "There's something else you should know. The investigation has expanded beyond Consolidated Foods. We've identified financial connections between them and 3 major agribusiness corporations, including Evergreen Agricultural Enterprises." Jackson felt a chill of realization. "The company that's been buying up all the family farms around us, the one whose manager was at the distribution center that day?" Reynolds nodded. "Martin Davis is cooperating with investigators." According to his testimony, Evergreen has been systematically pressuring small organic farms into financial distress through various means, including orchestrating the thefts you experienced, then acquiring their properties at below-market rates. "For the water rights," Olivia interjected, connecting final pieces of the puzzle. "They weren't just after cheap organic produce for fraud. They were purposely undermining viable organic farms to acquire their land and water access." "Precisely," confirmed Reynolds. "This appears to be a multifaceted strategy. Profit from organic fraud in the short term, while simultaneously consolidating control of key agricultural resources for the long term." When the hearing resumed, Jackson found himself answering increasingly complex questions about the economic pressures facing small organic farmers and the vulnerability of the certification system to corporate manipulation. Despite his lack of political experience, his authentic perspective resonated powerfully with committee members and observers alike. "Mr. Hayes," asked Congressman James Richardson, a representative from a major agricultural state, "in your view, what changes would provide meaningful protection against the type of fraud your tracking system uncovered?" Jackson considered carefully before responding. 3 things would make an immediate difference. First, trace verification technology that consumers themselves can access, similar to my UV markers, but implemented systematically. Second, meaningful penalties for fraud that reflect the actual financial gains obtained through deception, not just symbolic fines. And third, protection for small producers who report suspicious patterns, including financial support during investigations when their operations are disrupted. His practical suggestions, born from direct experience rather than abstract policy theory, drew approving nods from committee members on both sides of the political spectrum. As the hearing concluded, Chairwoman Watkins made an unexpected announcement. Based on testimony heard today and evidence provided by ongoing investigations, this committee is immediately drafting the Organic Integrity and Farm Protection Act, incorporating Mr. Hayes' recommendations, along with additional oversight mechanisms. We intend to fast-track this legislation with bipartisan support. As Jackson and Olivia exited the hearing room, they were surrounded by journalists seeking comments on the proceedings. Among the press scrum, Jackson noticed a distinguished older man patiently waiting at the periphery. When the initial wave of questions subsided, the man approached. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Dr. William Foster, Director of the National Agricultural Research Foundation. Your tracking system's effectiveness has inspired our engineering team. We'd like to develop a standardized version that could be implemented across organic supply chains nationwide. Would you be willing to consult on the project?" Before Jackson could respond, his phone buzzed with a notification. Tyler Rodriguez had just posted an update to the original viral video, "Consumer-led blacklight inspections of organic produce had now spread to 17 countries, with similar fraud patterns emerging in European and Asian markets." The simple tracking system designed in a farmhouse workshop had sparked a global consumer movement for food authenticity verification. Later that evening, as Jackson stood on the balcony of his hotel room overlooking the illuminated monuments of Washington, he tried to reconcile the magnitude of what had been set in motion by his desperate attempt to catch local thieves. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from farmers nationwide, many sharing their own stories of suspicious thefts and market pressures. A call from Olivia interrupted his reflection. "Dad, you need to see the news. Consolidated Foods stock has been suspended from trading pending investigation outcomes. The SEC has joined the case, examining potential securities fraud related to misrepresentation of organic inventory assets." "And Evergreen?" Jackson asked, thinking of the corporate neighbor that had been systematically pressuring local farms. Their parent company issued a statement separating themselves from regional management and pledging full cooperation with investigators, Olivia replied. Classic damage control. But here's the interesting part. 3 other major agribusiness corporations have suddenly announced enhanced organic verification programs for their distribution chains. They're scrambling to avoid being caught in the same net. What Jackson Hayes couldn't possibly know, as he gazed across the capital city so far removed from his tomato fields, was that his tracking system had initiated a fundamental restructuring of agricultural verification practices worldwide. The UV powder that had begun as a farmer's desperate defensive measure was evolving into a new paradigm of supply chain transparency, one that would ultimately shift power back toward authentic producers and informed consumers, away from the corporate intermediaries that had exploited the gap between them. The humble farmer who had simply wanted to protect his tomatoes had inadvertently catalyzed a movement that was rapidly spreading beyond agriculture into broader questions of consumer protection, corporate accountability, and resource preservation. And as evidence continued mounting across regulatory investigations and citizen-led verification efforts, the implications were expanding from grocery shelves to global food security policy. Tomorrow, Jackson would meet with technology developers, agricultural researchers, and policy experts, all seeking to build upon his improvised tracking system. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment to absorb the improbable journey from desperate farmer to congressional witness, and to wonder what his great-grandfather would have thought about how a simple trap for tomato thieves had exposed vulnerabilities in systems he could never have imagined. 3 months after his congressional testimony, Jackson Hayes stood in the same tomato fields where the story had begun. The morning sun illuminated rows of healthy plants, now protected by something far more powerful than his homemade tracking system: public awareness and institutional reform. "The new seedlings are coming in strong," he remarked to Olivia, who was photographing their latest crop for the farm's suddenly popular social media accounts. "Never thought I'd see the day when people would request Hayes Farm authenticated produce by name." The transformation of their operation had been as dramatic as it was unexpected. The UV tracking system that began as a desperate security measure had evolved into an officially recognized producer-verified certification, the first of its kind approved by the USDA's revamped organic program. Each Hayes Farm product now carried a scannable code, allowing consumers to verify its authenticity through a smartphone app developed in partnership with the National Agricultural Research Foundation. Channel 5 will be here at noon for the feature. "On the pilot program," Olivia reminded him, reviewing their schedule, "and the governor's rural economic development team right after. Are you sure you don't want me to handle those meetings?" Jackson shook his head. "People need to hear this from an actual farmer. That's been the problem all along. Too many layers between the people who grow the food and the people who eat it." His phone buzzed with an incoming video call from Dr. Foster at the Agricultural Research Foundation. Jackson still found the technology somewhat awkward, but had adapted quickly to his unexpected role as the public face of agricultural verification reform. "Jackson! Great news from Washington!" Foster announced when the connection established. The Organic Integrity and Farm Protection Act passed the Senate committee vote this morning, 17-2. With that kind of bipartisan support, full passage is practically guaranteed. That's faster than anyone predicted, Jackson replied, genuinely surprised at the legislative efficiency. What about the enforcement provisions? Fully intact, Foster confirmed. Mandatory supply chain verification technology, enhanced penalties based on percentage of fraudulent revenue, and the whistleblower protection fund for farmers who report suspected fraud. Your 3 recommendations are the cornerstone of the legislation. As they discussed implementation details, Jackson marveled at how quickly the political landscape had shifted. The organic fraud exposed by his tracking system had created that rarest of circumstances, an issue that transcended partisan divides. Conservatives saw it as protecting free market integrity and traditional agricultural values. Progressives viewed it as environmental protection and corporate accountability. The result was the most significant agricultural oversight legislation in decades, moving through Congress with unprecedented speed. After finishing the call, Jackson walked toward the section of the farm that had changed most dramatically in recent months. The formerly unused back 40 acres were now alive with activity as researchers from 3 universities conducted field trials of various verification technologies. What began with his UV powder and simple trackers had sparked an innovation race to develop the most reliable, cost-effective methods for ensuring food supply chain integrity. "Mr. Hayes," called a young researcher, waving him over to a demonstration area, "we've refined the molecular tag system based on your feedback. Now it can be applied during irrigation with no additional labor steps for farmers." Jackson examined the system with a practiced eye, impressed by how quickly the technology had evolved, but careful to evaluate each innovation from a working farmer's practical perspective. His unexpected role as consultant to these development teams had centered around one simple question he asked of every proposed solution. Will this work on a real farm on a rainy Tuesday when you're already behind schedule and short-staffed? This insistence on practical implementation had made him both respected and occasionally frustrating to the technical teams, but it had also ensured that the emerging verification systems remained feasible for actual agricultural operations, rather than just laboratory demonstrations. By midday, the farm had transformed into an impromptu media center as the local news team set up for their feature story. Instead of focusing solely on Jackson, Olivia had insisted they highlight the coalition of regional organic farmers who had been affected by the same theft and fraud patterns. Miguel, Sarah, Dean, and Layla stood alongside Jackson, representing the newly formed Authentic Producers Network that had grown from their shared experience. What began as a crisis for individual farms has become an opportunity for collective action, Miguel explained to the reporter. The verification technology that Jackson pioneered has allowed small producers to reclaim market trust that corporate fraud had undermined. We're seeing a 31% increase in direct-to-consumer sales through farmers' markets and CSA programs, added Sarah, citing figures from their first quarterly report. When people can verify authenticity, they're choosing to purchase directly from farmers again, rather than relying on corporate distribution chains. As the interviews continued, Jackson noticed an unfamiliar vehicle approaching the farm entrance. The black SUV parked near the barn, and Martin Davis, the former Evergreen agricultural manager who had helped them escape the distribution center, emerged, looking considerably less polished than during their previous encounters. "Mr. Hayes," he called, approaching cautiously, aware of the media presence. "Do you have a moment to talk privately?" Jackson excused himself from the filming, curious about this unexpected visit from a man now known to be cooperating with federal investigators. They walked toward the original Hayes family barn, a structure that had witnessed 4 generations of agricultural challenges, but surely nothing like the events of recent months. "I wanted you to hear this directly from me," Martin began once. They were alone. "I've provided testimony about Evergreen's full operational strategy, including the coordination with Consolidated Foods and 2 other distribution companies. It wasn't just about organic fraud. That was merely the profitable short-term tactic." "What was the long-term goal?" Jackson asked, though he had already formed suspicions. "Water rights acquisition," Martin confirmed. "The corporate strategy identified key agricultural properties controlling watershed access across 27 counties in 4 states. The plan was systematic: undermine small organic operations through market manipulation, targeted theft, and distribution fraud, then acquire distressed properties at reduced values." Jackson felt a chill despite the warm day. "For the water, not the land," Martin nodded grimly. "Internal projections suggested water rights would triple in value over the next decade due to climate shifts and aquifer depletion. The agricultural operations were simply the legal mechanism to control the water resources." "Why are you telling me this now?" Jackson asked, studying the man who had once been the face of corporate pressure on local farms. "Because the federal settlement includes immunity for cooperation," Martin admitted with frank pragmatism. "But also because people should understand what was really happening. It wasn't just about selling fake organic tomatoes. It was about controlling who has access to water for the next 50 years. Before Jackson could respond, Olivia approached with news that the governor's rural economic development team had arrived early. The conversation with Martin would have to continue later, but his revelations added a deeper dimension to the already complex situation, one that extended beyond food integrity to resource control with implications for entire agricultural regions. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of interviews, demonstrations, and policy discussions. The national attention that had begun with a viral video had evolved into sustained institutional focus on agricultural verification systems, with Hayes Farm as the unlikely epicenter of innovation and policy development. That evening, as the last visitors departed, Jackson sat on the farmhouse porch with Olivia and Tyler Rodriguez, whose original video had catalyzed the movement. On Tyler's laptop, they reviewed the latest monitoring dashboard showing real-time data from consumer verification scans across the country. "Over 780,000 scans today alone," Tyler noted, scrolling through the analytics. "People aren't just accepting labels anymore, they're actively verifying authenticity before purchasing. That's a fundamental shift in consumer behavior." What happens when the media attention eventually fades, Jackson wondered. Always the pragmatist despite their current success. "That's the beauty of this system," Olivia replied. "It doesn't require constant attention to function. Once verification becomes habitual for consumers and integrated into farming operations, it's self-sustaining." Tyler nodded in agreement. "Traditional media might move on, but the infrastructure remains. The app has 12 million downloads. Verification. Stations are being installed in grocery stores nationwide, and the international adoption is accelerating. This isn't a temporary story. It's a permanent change in how food systems operate." As if to confirm this assessment, Jackson's phone alerted him to a notification from the farm's monitoring system. Not an alarm, but an authenticity verification. Bing, showing that someone in Seattle had just scanned and purchased tomatoes harvested from their farm 3 days earlier. The system that began as defense against thieves now allowed him to track his produce through legitimate distribution channels all the way to the final consumer. A level of supply chain transparency previously unimaginable for small farmers. Later, that night, after everyone had departed, Jackson walked the perimeter of his fields under a clear, starlit sky. The land that had sustained his family for 4 generations had become something he never anticipated, a living laboratory for agricultural verification technology and a symbol of small farmer resilience against corporate exploitation. What Jackson Hayes couldn't fully appreciate as he contemplated the remarkable journey from desperate farmer to agricultural innovator was how completely his simple tracking system had disrupted entrenched power structures in the food distribution system. The transparency made possible by his verification approach had shifted leverage back toward authentic producers and informed consumers, creating accountability that corporate intermediaries had successfully avoided for decades. The UV powder that began as a trap for tomato thieves had illuminated not just stolen produce, but systematic vulnerabilities throughout the food supply chain. The resulting transparency had revealed not only fraud, but the deeper strategy of resource control that threatened the very existence of independent farming. And as verification technology continued evolving from his original concept, it was creating protective infrastructure that would outlast any single investigation or legislative action. The humble farmer who had simply wanted to catch nighttime vegetable thieves had inadvertently initiated a fundamental restructuring of agricultural verification practices, one that promised to preserve not just his family's farm, but the viability of authentic production throughout the food system. As consumer behavior, regulatory frameworks, and market incentives realigned around transparency, the conditions that had made widespread fraud possible were disappearing, replaced by systems that inherently rewarded authenticity rather than deception. Tomorrow would bring more researchers, more policy discussions, and more media attention. But tonight, walking the same soil his great-grandfather had tended over a century earlier, Jackson allowed himself to appreciate how a simple, desperate measure to protect his crops had grown into something that would help ensure those same fields could remain in his family for generations to come, and do the same for countless other farming families facing similar challenges across the country. 6 months after the Organic Integrity and Farm Protection Act passed, with overwhelming bipartisan support, Jackson Hayes found himself in an environment he could never have imagined before his tracking system went viral. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization headquarters in Rome, Italy. "I still can't believe we're here," he muttered to Olivia, as they were escorted through the impressive atrium of the international complex. The 4th-generation farmer, who rarely traveled beyond state lines, was now addressing global agricultural representatives about the verification system that had begun with UV powder and homemade trackers in his workshop. The Hayes Protocol is already being implemented in 23 countries, replied Dr. Foster, who had accompanied them as representative of the National Agricultural Research Foundation. Your concept of consumer-accessible verification has transformed from a security measure into a global food trust framework. Jackson shook his head in quiet amazement. The Hayes Protocol, a term he still found somewhat embarrassing, had evolved far beyond his original desperate measure. What began as a trap for tomato thieves had been refined, standardized, and expanded into a comprehensive approach to supply chain verification now being adopted by agricultural systems worldwide. "Mr. Hayes, we're ready for you in the main chamber," announced their UN escort. "The Secretary-General will introduce you following the opening statements." The Grand Assembly Hall was filled with agricultural ministers, food security experts, and sustainability advocates from nearly every nation. On the massive screens surrounding the chamber, Jackson recognized images of his own farm alongside verification systems now operating in European organic vineyards, South American coffee cooperatives, and Asian rice collectives. "I'm just a farmer," he whispered to Olivia as they took their places on the presentation stage. "How did we get here?" "By solving a problem that affected everyone," she replied simply. "Food authenticity isn't just an American issue." The Secretary General's introduction highlighted the remarkable journey of Hayes Farm's verification innovation. What began as one farmer's defense against theft has evolved into perhaps the most significant advancement in food supply chain transparency of the past 50 years. The Hayes Protocol has demonstrated that verification technology, when properly implemented, can restore trust between producers and consumers while creating market conditions that inherently reward authentic practices. As Jackson approached the podium, he felt the weight of the moment, but also the grounding certainty of his experience. He wasn't here as a policy expert or technology specialist. He was here as a farmer whose practical innovation had addressed a fundamental vulnerability in global food systems. "I never set out to create a protocol or start a movement," he began, his straightforward manner translating effectively even through the simultaneous interpretation systems. "I just wanted to protect my tomatoes and find out who was stealing them." But what we discovered through that simple tracking system was that the theft was just a symptom of a much deeper problem: the disconnection between how food is produced and how it reaches consumers. Over the next 20 minutes, Jackson outlined the practical implementation of verification systems from a producer's perspective, emphasizing accessibility, ease of use, and tangible benefits for farmers. Unlike technical experts who focused on sophisticated mechanisms, Jackson's presentation centered on real-world application, the challenges, adjustments, and unexpected benefits they had discovered through implementing verification at Hayes Farm and across the authentic producers network. "The technology itself isn't revolutionary," he explained. "What's revolutionary is putting verification power directly in the hands of both producers and consumers, removing the information monopoly that allowed fraud to flourish in the middle of the supply chain." Following his presentation, agricultural representatives from diverse regions shared their experiences implementing variations of the Hayes Protocol. A coffee cooperative in Colombia had adapted the verification system to combat widespread counterfeiting of premium beans. Olive oil producers in Greece had developed molecular markers to address notorious authentication challenges in their industry. Japanese rice farmers had implemented block-level verification to protect traditional varieties from substitution. What struck Jackson most powerfully was how each implementation maintained the core principle of his original system: direct transparency between producer and consumer, bypassing the vulnerable intermediary stages where fraud had traditionally occurred. During the lunch break, Jackson was approached by Amara Okafor, Nigeria's dynamic Minister of Agricultural Development. "Mr. Hayes, your verification approach has particular relevance for developing agricultural economies," she explained. "When small farmers can authenticate their products directly to consumers, they retain significantly more value than when corporate intermediaries control verification. We've seen income increases of 40 to 60% for verified producers in our pilot regions." This economic perspective highlighted an aspect of verification that had emerged unexpectedly. Beyond preventing fraud, the system was fundamentally restructuring value distribution throughout the food supply chain. When consumers could verify authenticity directly, they were increasingly choosing shorter supply chains and direct purchasing models, shifting economic leverage back toward actual producers. As the international forum continued, Jackson participated, in working groups focused on practical implementation challenges. His insistence on farmer-centered design had become a guiding principle in the global expansion of verification systems, technology that couldn't be easily adopted by working agricultural operations wouldn't succeed regardless of its theoretical elegance. The verification crisis exposed by Hayes Farm has accelerated a trend that was already emerging, noted the European Union's Agricultural Commissioner during the closing session. Consumers increasingly want connection to their food sources. The technology now provides infrastructure for trust the corporate consolidation had systematically undermined. What Jackson found most meaningful about the international gathering wasn't the technical discussions or policy frameworks. It was the conversations with farmers from diverse regions who shared remarkably similar experiences of market pressure, resource threats, and corporate manipulation. The verification system had provided a common language and tool for addressing challenges that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. On their final evening in Rome, Jackson and Olivia received an unexpected invitation to meet with representatives from the International Water Resource Consortium, a network of experts focused on agricultural water access and management. The meeting added crucial context to Martin Davis's earlier revelations about water rights being the ultimate target of corporate acquisition strategies. What you expose through your tracking system connects directly to global patterns of resource control, explained Dr. Eliana Vega, the consortium's research director. We've documented similar patterns across multiple continents, corporate entities using manipulated agricultural markets as mechanisms to acquire control of water resources. She displayed a global map highlighting regions where corporate consolidation of farmland correlated directly with watershed control points, creating effective monopolies over critical water sources that extended far beyond agricultural use. The verification technology that began on your farm does more than protect food authenticity, Dr. Vega continued. By preserving the economic viability of distributed agricultural production, it indirectly prevents the consolidation of water resource control that represents perhaps the most significant threat to food sovereignty worldwide. This perspective expanded Jackson's understanding of why his simple tracking system had resonated so powerfully across diverse agricultural contexts. The fraud he had exposed wasn't merely about mislabeled food products. It was part of a sophisticated strategy to undermine independent production as a pathway to controlling fundamental resources. When they returned to Hayes Farm the following week, Jackson found that the international recognition had created new momentum for the Authentic Producers Network. Membership had expanded to over 3,000 verified farms across North America, with implementation support now provided through regional hubs that offered technical assistance, equipment access, and marketing coordination. The network passed $50 million in direct verified sales last quarter, Olivia reported, as they reviewed the latest data. The average price premium for verified products is holding steady at 22% above conventional retail, with producers receiving approximately 71% of final sale value compared to 16% in traditional distribution models. These numbers represented more than abstract market statistics. They translated directly to farm viability, particularly for small and mid-sized operations that had been most vulnerable to corporate pressure and fraud-driven market manipulation. The verification system had created conditions where authentic production could compete effectively against even the largest agricultural conglomerates. As summer transitioned to early fall, Jackson walked the fields where his fourth harvest since the tracking system was implemented was nearing completion. The farm had changed dramatically in those months, not in its fundamental character or practices, but in its relationship to the broader agricultural ecosystem. What had once been an isolated operation struggling against mysterious market forces was now a node in a robust network of verified producers. The Hayes Farm logo, now incorporating the verification system's distinctive marker, appeared on products distributed through direct channels throughout the region and beyond. The economic stability provided by fraud-resistant markets had allowed them to implement succession planning, ensuring the operation would remain in the family for a fifth generation and beyond. Most significantly, the pressure from corporate acquisition had evaporated as verification transparency made the strategy of undermining small producers through market manipulation increasingly ineffective. The evergreen agricultural land surrounding Hayes Farm had recently been sold to a cooperative of young farmers implementing regenerative practices with verification. Technology integrated from the start. As Jackson supervised the loading of their premium tomato harvest, each container now carrying molecular markers and digital tracking that would allow verification throughout its journey to consumers, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that his simple tracking system had initiated. What Jackson Hayes couldn't fully appreciate, even after seeing its global implementation, was how fundamentally his innovation had altered power relationships throughout the food system. By making authenticity directly verifiable, he had eliminated the information asymmetry that had allowed corporate intermediaries to extract disproportionate value and manipulate markets to their advantage. The resulting realignment of economic incentives had created conditions where distributed, sustainable production could thrive rather than merely survive. The UV powder that began as a desperate measure to catch nighttime thieves had illuminated not just fraud, but systematic vulnerabilities that extended throughout global food systems and into critical resource management. And as verification technology continued evolving from his original concept, it was creating protective infrastructure for authentic production that would endure far beyond any single policy initiative or market trend. The humble farmer, who had simply wanted to protect his tomatoes, had inadvertently catalyzed a transformation in how food systems operate, shifting leverage toward those who actually grow food and those who ultimately consume it, while creating transparency that inherently rewarded honest practices. And as implementation continued expanding across diverse agricultural contexts worldwide, the verification approach was preserving not just food authenticity, but the distributed production model essential for sustainable resource management and food sovereignty. What had begun in desperation at Hayes Family Farms had evolved into something Jackson had never imagined. A globally implemented framework for agricultural trust that was systematically dismantling the conditions that had made his own farm vulnerable to theft, fraud, and resource appropriation in the first place. 5 years to the day after Jackson, Hayes discovered the first theft of his heirloom tomatoes. Hayes Family Farms hosted an event that would have been unimaginable half a decade earlier. The Verification Innovation Summit brought together over 300 farmers, technology developers, policy experts, and food system advocates to the once struggling farm that had become an unlikely epicenter of agricultural transformation. Under white tents erected across fields that had once been targeted by corporate-sponsored thieves, displays showcased the remarkable evolution of verification technology. Jackson's primitive UV powder and homemade trackers had inspired 5 generations of increasingly sophisticated systems, culminating in the current V5 standard being implemented across global supply chains. "Still can't believe all this came from trying to catch some tomato thieves," Jackson remarked to Miguel as they watched attendees exploring interactive demonstrations. At 63, the farmer's weathered face had gained a few more lines, but his eyes reflected the satisfaction of seeing the farm not just preserved, but thriving under a system that rewarded authentic production. "The best innovations come from real needs, not theoretical problems," Miguel replied. His own organic operation had expanded significantly under the protection of verification systems, allowing his children to join the family business rather than seek opportunities elsewhere. "You solved a practical problem that affected all of us, even if we didn't recognize it yet." The summit's timing coincided with the 5-year assessment of the Organic Integrity and Farm Protection Act, which had exceeded even its most optimistic projections. Reported cases of organic fraud had declined by 87% nationwide. Small and mid-sized farm operations had increased for the first time in over 40 years, reversing a decades-long trend of consolidation. Most significantly, consumer confidence in certification systems had reached unprecedented levels, with verification now an expected component of premium food purchases. At the central presentation stage, Olivia Hayes, now serving as executive director of the Authentic Producers Network while maintaining her role in the family farm, introduced the summit's keynote speaker, Congresswoman Eleanor Watkins, the legislative champion who had shepherded the verification framework from concept to national policy. 5 years ago, a farmer with a simple tracking system showed us what was possible when we connect production directly to consumption through transparency. Watkins began, addressing the assembled crowd. Today, we celebrate not just technology, but a fundamental shift in how our food systems operate, a shift toward integrity, accountability, and distributed resilience. The Congresswoman outlined 5 transformative impacts that had emerged from what was now commonly called the Hayes Revolution in agricultural verification. First, economic redistribution had measurably shifted value back toward actual producers. Verified farms now received an average of 73% of the final purchase price for their products, a dramatic increase from the 16 to 22% typical in conventional distribution. Second, resource protection had been strengthened as verification prevented the systematic undermining of small farms that had facilitated corporate acquisition of water rights and land consolidation. Third, rural revitalization had accelerated as verification-protected markets made small and mid-sized agricultural operations economically viable again, creating sustainable livelihoods that kept younger generations engaged in farming. Fourth, environmental practices had improved as verification transparency inherently rewarded sustainable methods, creating market incentives that aligned economic and ecological interests without requiring external subsidies. Fifth, and perhaps most profoundly, verification had restored trust between producers and consumers, rebuilding connections that industrial food systems had systematically severed over decades of consolidation and complexity. The genius of the Hayes approach wasn't technological sophistication, Watkins concluded. It was reconnecting the ends of our food system, those who grow food and those who eat it, with transparency that eliminated the information asymmetry exploited by corporate intermediaries. Following the keynote, Jackson led a walking tour of Hayes Farm's verification operations for a group of international agricultural officials. The farm had grown moderately in acreage, but exponentially in productivity and profitability under the protection of verification systems. 3 of Jackson's nieces and nephews had joined the operation, ensuring continuity through another generation, while the surrounding landscape had transformed from corporate monoculture back to a diverse patchwork of family farms and cooperative enterprises. We're not just verifying products anymore, Jackson explained as they examined the farm's integrated systems. We're verifying practices, resource stewardship, and community impact. The technology creates visibility across dimensions that were previously hidden from consumers. As the tour concluded, near the original tomato fields where the story began, Jackson was approached by Amara Okafor, now serving as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Food Systems Transparency. Her implementation of verification systems across agricultural regions in Africa had demonstrated perhaps the most dramatic impacts, with smallholder farmer incomes increasing by over 130% when digital verification eliminated exploitative middlemen. "Your simple idea changed more than just American agriculture," she told him, gesturing toward the global representatives gathered at the summit. "By making authenticity verifiable, you shifted power throughout food systems worldwide." Later that afternoon, a special ceremony recognized the expanded impact of verification beyond agriculture. The verified authentic framework that grew from Jackson's approach had been adapted for fisheries management, textile production, handicrafts, and even certain categories of digital content, all contexts where authenticating origin and methods created value that had previously been captured by intermediaries rather than actual producers. "We originally thought we were fighting food fraud," noted Dr. Foster during the ceremony. "What we were actually addressing was a fundamental information imbalance that had allowed consolidation of power throughout production systems. By making authentication accessible to both producers and consumers, we eliminated the leverage point that corporate intermediaries had exploited for decades." As evening approached, the summit transitioned to a celebration featuring verified local products from throughout the region, under strings of lights illuminating the farmyard where Jackson had once worked late into the night. Building his primitive tracking devices, farmers, technologists, and policymakers mingled, united by their connection to a verification movement that had transcended its agricultural origins. Jackson found himself sharing a quiet moment with Martin Davis, whose cooperation with investigators had been instrumental in exposing the full scope of corporate strategies targeting small farms. After serving as a key witness in multiple fraud cases, Martin had reinvented himself as an advocate for rural community development, helping vulnerable agricultural regions implement verification systems as protection against corporate exploitation. "I never properly thanked you," Jackson acknowledged, "for helping us that day at the distribution center." Martin shook his head. "I was part of the system targeting your farm. Whatever I did later doesn't erase that." "Maybe not," Jackson replied, "but it does prove something important about this verification approach. It works by creating conditions where doing the right thing becomes the rational choice. The transparency makes exploitation less profitable than cooperation." The philosophical observation from the practical farmer highlighted what many considered the most revolutionary aspect of the Hayes verification framework. Rather than relying on external enforcement to prevent fraud, it created market conditions where transparency inherently rewarded authentic practices and made deception increasingly costly and difficult. As the celebration continued into the evening, Olivia joined her father at the summit's central display, a museum-quality installation, juxtaposing Jackson's original homemade tracking devices with the sophisticated verification technology they had inspired. The primitive UV powder trackers that had caught tomato thieves appeared alongside molecular markers, blockchain verification systems, and consumer authentication apps now used by millions worldwide. "Did you ever imagine any of this?" she asked, gesturing toward the summit that had brought global leaders in agriculture, technology, and policy to their once struggling family farm. Jackson smiled, shaking his head. "I just wanted to catch whoever was stealing our tomatoes. Everything else came from people recognizing that the problem was bigger than my farm and that the solution could be bigger too." What neither Jackson nor Olivia could fully appreciate, even 5 years into the verification revolution, was how fundamentally their simple tracking system had altered power relationships throughout production systems worldwide. By making authenticity directly verifiable, they had eliminated the information asymmetry that had allowed extractive intermediaries to control markets, manipulate prices, and capture disproportionate value. The resulting realignment had created conditions where distributed, sustainable production could thrive rather than merely survive against corporate consolidation. As the evening concluded, and summit participants departed with plans to reconvene the following year, Jackson took a solitary walk through the tomato fields where it had all begun. The plants were different varieties now, selected for flavor and regional adaptation rather than shipping durability, but they grew in the same soil that had sustained the Hayes family for 5 generations. The simple farmer who had set a trap for vegetable thieves had never sought to create a protocol or start a movement. He had simply wanted to protect his crop and understand who was threatening his livelihood. But the verification system born from that desperate measure had illuminated vulnerabilities that extended throughout global production systems, and in addressing those vulnerabilities, had helped create a more transparent, equitable, and resilient approach to agriculture that promised to sustain Hayes family farms for generations to come. As Jackson gazed across fields now secured not by fences or surveillance, but by transparency and direct connection to consumers who valued authentic production, he reflected on the unlikely journey from crisis to transformation. The system he had created to catch thieves had evolved into something that protected not just his tomatoes, but the very concept of authenticity in a world increasingly dominated by corporate intermediation and disconnection. What had begun as one farmer's desperate defensive measure had grown into a framework for transparency that was systematically dismantling the conditions that had made his own farm vulnerable in the first place, creating instead a world where verification connected producers directly with those who valued their products, eliminating the shadowed spaces where fraud and exploitation had previously flourished. The humble trap that had caught tomato thieves 5 years earlier had ultimately captured something far more significant: a pathway toward agricultural systems where transparency naturally rewarded integrity, sustainability, and connection, values that had guided Hayes family farms through 5 generations and would continue shaping its future in ways Jackson Hayes had never imagined when he first discovered his missing tomatoes on that summer morning. Half a decade ago, 10 years after Jackson Hayes first discovered thieves targeting his heirloom tomatoes, the Hayes family gathered for a momentous occasion that symbolized how completely their world had transformed. Under the spreading branches of a century-old oak tree that had witnessed 5 generations of Hayes farmers tending the same soil, Jackson, now approaching 70, prepared to formally transition primary management of the farm to the next generation. "Never thought I'd see this day," he admitted to Olivia as they watched family members and friends arriving for the ceremony. 10 years ago, we were weeks away from losing everything. The farm that had once teetered on the edge of foreclosure had become not just economically sustainable, but a thriving enterprise that now supported multiple branches of the Hayes family. What began as 75 struggling acres had evolved into the Hayes Agricultural Collective, a 320-acre operation combining traditional farming with education, research, and verification technology development. "The Smithsonian called again," Olivia mentioned, reviewing messages on her tablet. "They want to include your original tracking devices in their permanent exhibition on innovations that changed American agriculture. They're placing you right, alongside Eli Whitney's Cotton Gin and the McCormick Reaper." Jackson chuckled at the comparison. "Seems excessive for some UV powder and homemade trackers." "It's not about the technology itself," came a new voice. Dr. William Foster, now director of the Global Agricultural Verification Institute, approached with a distinguished visitor in tow. It's about the paradigm shift your innovation triggered. He introduced Dr. Mei Zhang, Harvard's newly appointed professor of agricultural economics and author of the definitive analysis, The Hays Revolution: How Verification Transparency Restructured Global Food Systems. Mr. Hays, she greeted him with evident admiration. Your verification framework has become the central case study in transformative agricultural innovation. What makes it so remarkable is that unlike most agricultural revolutions driven by yield increases or input efficiencies, yours focused entirely on information symmetry, yet produced more profound economic restructuring than any yield-based innovation of the past 50 years. The academic assessment might have seemed abstract if the results weren't so tangibly visible around them. The Hays farm itself told the story. Fields thriving with diverse crops selected for flavor and nutrition rather than shipping durability. Young farmers working alongside agricultural veterans. Digital infrastructure seamlessly integrated with traditional practices. And most significantly, economic stability built on direct relationships with consumers who valued verified, authentic production. The ceremony began with a gathering of over 200 people representing the extensive network that had grown from Jackson's original tracking system. Miguel, Sarah, Dean and Layla, the original farmer allies who had joined Jackson's cause, now led regional hubs of the Authentic Producers Network, which had expanded to include over 21,000 verified farms across North America. Congresswoman Watkins, nearing retirement after a distinguished career, delivered opening remarks highlighting the broader impacts of verification transparency. What the Hays approach demonstrated wasn't just a solution to fraud, it was a pathway to realigning incentives throughout our food system. By making authenticity verifiable, this humble farm sparked a transformation that has rebuilt rural economies, enhanced environmental stewardship, and reconnected consumers with the sources of their food. The most moving moment came when Jackson formally transferred operational leadership to a management team that embodied the farm's transformation. Olivia Hays as strategic director, his nephew Michael Hays as head of agricultural operations, and surprisingly Tyler Rodriguez, the neighbor whose social media skills had first amplified their story, as technology and communications leader. This farm has survived for 5 generations because it adapted to changing conditions while maintaining core values, Jackson told the assembled crowd. 10 years ago, we faced a threat we didn't initially understand. Not just thieves taking our tomatoes, but a system designed to undermine independent farms through market manipulation and resource control. He gestured toward the verification monitoring center that now occupied what had once been a simple storage barn. The tracking system we built out of desperation revealed how disconnection between producers and consumers created vulnerability. The solution wasn't just catching thieves, it was rebuilding that connection through transparency that couldn't be manipulated. Following the ceremony, the gathering transitioned to a harvest celebration featuring verified products from throughout the region. The event had become an annual tradition, bringing together farmers, chefs, consumers, and advocates to celebrate the authentic agricultural production that verification had helped protect and expand. As Jackson moved through the celebration, he was approached by a journalist preparing a documentary on the 10th anniversary of the verification movement. Mr. Hays, you've seen verification technology evolve through multiple generations now. What do you consider its most significant impact? Jackson considered the question carefully. Most people focus on the technology or even the policy changes, but those aren't the heart of it. The real transformation was psychological. verification restored something that had been systematically eliminated from our food system. Trust based on direct knowledge rather than proxy certification or corporate assurance. And that changed. Economic outcomes, the journalist pressed. Fundamentally, Jackson confirmed, when consumers can verify authenticity directly, they make different choices. Those choices create markets that reward actual value creation rather than value extraction. The technology just made visible what had previously been hidden: who produces our food, how they produce it, and how it reaches us. Later that evening, as the celebration continued under starlit skies, Jackson found a quiet moment with Dr. Foster, whose research partnership had been instrumental in developing the original tracking concept into implemented systems. "Did you see the latest economic assessment?" Foster asked. "Verified production models have reversed the trend of consolidation in 6 major agricultural sectors. Family-scale operations are showing higher resilience metrics than corporate agriculture. For the first time in 70 years, because verification eliminated the information leverage that made consolidation profitable," Jackson noted. "When consumers can authenticate directly, the economic advantage shifts to distributed, accountable production." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Amara Okafor, now Director General of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the highest position in global agricultural policy. Her implementation of verification systems across developing nations had demonstrated the most dramatic impacts, with smallholder farmers increasing incomes by 215% when verification eliminated exploitative intermediaries. "The Hayes Protocol has been fully implemented in 78 countries," she reported. "The most recent assessment shows verified agricultural systems demonstrating 42% higher climate resilience and 67% better resource efficiency compared to conventional models, while delivering significantly improved economic outcomes for producers." These statistical validations confirmed what farmers had intuitively recognized from the beginning. Transparency inherently rewarded practices that created genuine value, while making exploitation and externalization increasingly costly and difficult. The verification framework had created conditions where doing the right thing became the profitable thing, aligning economic incentives with social and environmental benefits. As midnight approached, the celebration gradually wound down, with visitors departing and family members retiring to various houses on the expanded Hayes property. Jackson found himself drawn once more to the original fields where it all began, the section where those first heirloom tomatoes had been systematically harvested by thieves a decade earlier. In the quiet darkness, illuminated only by stars and distant security lights, he reflected on the extraordinary journey from crisis to transformation. The simple farmer who had set a trap for vegetable thieves had never imagined creating a verification protocol that would restructure global agricultural systems. He had simply wanted to protect his crop and understand who was threatening his livelihood. Yet the system born from that desperate measure had illuminated vulnerabilities that extended throughout production networks worldwide. And in addressing those vulnerabilities, had helped create more transparent, equitable, and resilient approaches to agriculture that promised to sustain Hayes family farms for generations to come. What Jackson Hayes couldn't fully appreciate, even a decade into the verification revolution, was how completely his simple innovation had altered fundamental power relationships throughout production systems globally. By making authenticity directly verifiable, the Hayes Protocol had eliminated the information asymmetry that had allowed extractive intermediaries to control markets, manipulate prices, and capture disproportionate value. The UV powder that began as a trap for tomato thieves, had illuminated not just fraud, but systematic vulnerabilities in how value was created, measured, and distributed throughout production systems. And the transparency made possible through verification had restructured those systems to reward authentic production, while making deception increasingly difficult and costly. As Jackson prepared to return to the farmhouse that had sheltered Hayes, farmers for over a century, he paused to observe a group of young agricultural students who had traveled from 3 continents to attend a verification technology workshop being held at the farm the following day. Their animated conversation, focused on applications ranging from coffee cooperatives to urban farming initiatives, represented the future of an approach that had begun with his desperate defensive measure. The humble farmer, who had simply wanted to catch nighttime vegetable thieves, could not have envisioned how his tracking system would evolve into a global framework for agricultural trust. But as he watched the next generation of innovators building upon his concept, he understood that the true power of his verification approach lay not in the specific technology, but in the principle it embodied. When production is transparent, authenticity becomes verifiable, and when authenticity is verifiable, systems naturally evolve toward integrity. The trap that caught tomato thieves had ultimately captured something far more significant, a pathway toward production systems where transparency naturally rewarded stewardship, sustainability, and direct connection. Values that had guided Hayes family farms through 5 generations and would now shape its future in ways Jackson Hayes could never have imagined on that summer morning when he first discovered his missing tomatoes and decided to do something about it. As he turned toward home, Jackson Hayes, farmer, innovator, and unintentional revolutionary, carried the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the farm he had fought so desperately to save would now sustain his family for generations to come. And more importantly, the verification system born from that struggle would continue protecting countless other farms facing similar challenges, creating a legacy of transparency that had transformed not just agriculture, but the fundamental relationship between those who create value and those who benefit from it. What had begun as one farmer's last desperate stand against theft and fraud had evolved into something that would outlast any individual or technology, a framework for trust that had rebalanced power throughout global production systems, and created conditions where honest stewardship could not only survive, but flourish in a world increasingly dominated by opacity and intermediation. The simple UV marker that had made stolen tomatoes visible under blacklight had ultimately illuminated something far more profound, a path towards systems where transparency creates accountability, accountability builds trust, and trust sustains the connections essential for truly resilient and equitable production, a legacy that would continue bearing fruit long after the original crop thief who unwittingly sparked a revolution had been forgotten. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.